By the fourth Thursday, half of Marrow Bend had noticed Caleb Rusk was crossing the covered bridge in the wrong direction. His room was north of the canal, above the cooper's shed, with his forge just beyond it. Mara Whit's rented room was south, over Mrs. Denby's dress shop, where the stair smelled of starch, coal smoke, and lavender soap. No man confused those two roads 4 Thursdays in a row. The first time there had been fog enough to excuse it. Not pretty fog. The thick canal fog that rolled off black water after sundown, swallowing hitching posts first, then wagon wheels, then whole buildings, until the freight office looked less like a place and more like a thought someone had forgotten to finish. Caleb came out of the depot with his coat buttoned wrong and his ledger strap still over one shoulder. "The bridge planks get slick in this weather," he said. Mara looked at him. The bridge was south. Everything Caleb owned was north. His bed, his tools, his supper, if he had remembered to make any of it. South held nothing of his except the road to her stair. She did not ask him to explain. He did not offer a better lie. They walked. He kept half a pace behind her until the bridge narrowed, then moved ahead just enough to find the weak boards before her shoe did. He never touched her arm. He only made the safer path appear under her feet, as if it had always meant to be there. "The bridge seems determined to throw respectable people into the canal," she said. "Only the ones who trust it too much." She glanced over to see if he had meant to be funny. His face gave no proof either way, so she saved the smile for later, when no one could use it against her. At the south end of the bridge, he stopped and looked back, not toward his room, not toward the forge, toward the little square of lamplight still burning in the freight office window. Mara understood something about him then. Caleb Rusk was the sort of man who could lock a door twice, cross a bridge, and still worry that the latch had been lonely without him. He turned back to her. They walked the last stretch in quiet. At the dress shop stair, she put her hand on the rail. "Good night, Miss Whit." "Good night, Mr. Rusk." She went in. Then she stood in the dim hallway with her gloves still on the rail, listening to his steps cross back over the bridge. The wrong way. The long way. Back past the office he had already checked. And the next Thursday, when the fog had lifted and the bridge was dry enough for children to run across it, Caleb Rusk crossed it anyway. Mara had been in Marrow Bend 19 days by then. She had arrived with one valise, 12 cents folded into a handkerchief, and a letter from Silas Crane promising her work as a clerk at Crane Freight. The trouble was, Silas Crane had been buried before her train reached the station. Caleb read the letter in the depot doorway while 2 mule teams waited behind her and 3 men watched for sport. "The position was Mr. Crane's promise," he said. His voice was not cruel. That almost made it worse. "Mr. Crane is gone." A wagoner behind her said something about women and invoices, soft enough to keep his cowardice tidy. Mara asked for the morning. Caleb looked past her at the stacked bills, the unpaid draymen, the crates sitting in the rain because nobody could agree which ones belonged on the westbound train. Then he stepped aside. By noon, Mara had found the error that had nearly cost the depot its winter account. 2 barrels of lamp oil had been billed twice. A rail company claim had been marked unpaid, and a receipt Silas Crane had written in a shaking hand was tucked inside the wrong packet, saving the freight house from a debt it did not owe. She laid the paper on Caleb's desk. He read it standing. Then he sat down slowly, as if the chair had only just become necessary. This was settled. Yes. 3 weeks ago. Yes. By dusk, everyone in the yard knew the woman with the valise was staying. That much Marrow Bend understood. What it did not understand was the bridge. The second Thursday came clear and cold, no fog, no slick planks. No excuse for Caleb to close the depot, pull on his coat, and walk south beside a woman whose stare he could see from his own office window. Mara let them reach the middle of the bridge before she spoke. "You know your supper is on the other side." He looked north through the ribs of the covered bridge. "I have been aware of that since last Thursday." And yet, a beat passed. "That has been the trouble," he said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, small and unfinished. Mara turned toward the dark water so he would not see what her own face was doing. Talking came easier after that. Not because either of them became brave, but because the bridge hid them for a dozen steps at a time. He told her Silas Crane had taken him on at 16, after Caleb's father died and pride had left him too hungry to admit he needed work. "Mr. Crane never made me say it," Caleb said. He kept his eyes on the boards. That told Mara nearly everything. It told her Caleb had learned young to place help where it was needed, before shame had to kneel and ask. So she gave him something in return. 4 years doing books for a dry goods store that closed, with her wages still inside it. A brother in Indiana who wrote twice a year, and helped never. A rooming house in Cincinnati where the landlady had smiled too much when Mara counted her last coins. Caleb listened without pressing. She was grateful for that. There were truths that could be carried more easily when no one demanded to see the full weight. At her stare, the cold came up from the canal and settled between them. "You do not have to walk me, Mr. Rusk." "I know." The answer should have ended it. It did not. Her hand stayed off the door. "Then why do you?" He looked at the stair, then at the road behind him, then at the bridge he would have to cross back alone. "Because I do not care to leave before I know you have a light above you." "That is a poor reason to cross a bridge in November." "I have lived on poorer ones." "Good night, Mr. Rusk." "Good night, Miss Whit." She climbed the stairs in the dark. She did not sleep well. She did not mind. By Sunday, Mrs. Denby had heard enough. She caught Mara in the dress shop doorway with a basket on one arm and a look so polished it had no kindness left in it. "A man can see a woman across a bridge all autumn," she said, "and still leave her on the wrong side by Christmas." Mara folded her gloves slowly. "He crosses because the canal road is dark." "Of course." Mrs. Denby's mouth did not soften. "Only, darkness has never stopped men from naming a kindness when it suits them, nor from forgetting to name it when it costs." Mara thanked her in the voice people use for advice that arrives sharpened. Then she stepped into the street. Caleb came out of the blacksmith's lane a moment later, hat in hand, and fell beside her. He did not say what he had heard. The set of his jaw told her enough. "The bridge is clear today," she said. "It is." "Then I expect you may safely remain north." He looked at her gloves, not her face. "Is that what you want?" Mara let the answer sit too long. "I want not to be the woman this town watches until it gets tired of being wrong." Something changed in him. Not anger, not quite hurt. something closer to a man finding the edge of a tool he did not know he had dropped. He walked her south anyway. At the stair, he said good night the same as always. But she went up not knowing whether she had warned him or wounded him. And she found that both troubled her. 2 Thursdays later, with the cold clean enough to make the stars look nailed into place, Caleb stopped before the bridge instead of on it. "I heard enough that Sunday," he said, "to know I let people put words on a thing I had not been honest enough to name." Mara kept her hand inside her muff. "And what would you name it?" He looked at the covered bridge, its mouth black against the road. "Not courtesy." She waited. His breath showed white. "Not only courtesy." It was not a promise. It was not even a full confession, but it crossed something. Mara felt it land under her ribs and stay there. "That is a careful answer." "I am a careful man." I had noticed. There was the almost smile again. This time she let herself see it. The following Thursday, Mara stopped before her stair. "You always walk south." Caleb turned toward her. "Everything you are responsible for is north." His eyes moved to the depot, the forge, the room above the cooper's shed, all of it waiting beyond the bridge. "Walk north with me once," she said. "Why?" "Because if everyone is going to make a story of the bridge, I would rather know what they think is on the other side." He held his hat in both hands, the brim bent once under his thumb. "If I ever ask you anything plain," he said, "it will be north of here." Neither of them moved. Then he offered his arm, not fully, just enough that refusing it would have made the moment smaller than it deserved. Mara took it, and together they crossed north. They went only as far as the cooper's shed, no farther. His forge stood beyond it, dark except for the low red sleep of banked coals. Past that was the narrow stair to his room, a place he never mentioned. It was not far enough to be a promise. It was too far to be nothing. At the cooper's shed, Caleb stopped, as if a line had been drawn in the road by both their silences. Then he turned back with her. They crossed south again in the same quiet. The bridge did not feel the same beneath her shoes. It had been a thing he gave. Now, for one brief stretch, it had been a thing they chose. At her stair, she said good night evenly enough. When the door closed behind her, Mara did not fight the smile. There was no one in the hall to see it win. The depot desk had a brass drawer pull with a jagged corner. Mara had caught her sleeve on it twice, and once opened a thin red line across her knuckle. She said nothing. The office had bigger troubles than one bad piece of brass. But one morning in late November, she reached for the drawer and found the pull newly filed, smooth as a river stone. She stood with her fingers on it longer than she meant to. Outside, Caleb was shoeing a mule in the cold yard, his sleeves rolled, his head down, acting as if the world had not shifted because a sharp corner had stopped hurting her. He had seen the cut. He had repaired the cause. He had not made her show him the wound. That was the danger of Caleb Rusk. He rarely said a thing. He simply removed what hurt and left a person alone with the knowledge. That afternoon, Pike Lanner brought a dispute to the loading platform in front of half the yard. He claimed his wool bales had been undercounted. He said it loudly because volume was the last refuge of men who had already lost to arithmetic. Caleb came off the shoeing block, took the ticket, and read Mara's hand. He did not ask for the scale. If Miss Whit wrote the count stands. Pike looked around for a man willing to save him. No one volunteered. He moved his wagon. Mara kept her face over the bill book until the yard remembered its own business. Later, after the last team rolled out, she poured coffee from the stove and set a cup on the outer sill, tucked behind the freight door where flour dust from the next wagon would not reach it. Not enough of an offering to be spoken of, too deliberate to be mistaken. She returned to her desk and did not look through the window. 10 minutes later, Caleb's boots crossed the platform. They stopped at the sill. Then everything inside her went inconveniently still. The next morning, he placed a paper-wrapped parcel on the corner of her desk. The baker had extra. The baker? Caleb looked toward the street as if the baker might appear and support the lie. He is not a wasteful man. Mara untied the string. The buns were still warm. Does the baker know he had extra? He may discover it later. Will he be surprised? Probably. This time the smile almost became visible. She ate one at her desk and watched him through the streaked glass for longer than the day's work could justify. He moved through the yard with that careful economy she had begun to recognize. A man making himself useful to the fragile parts of life and refusing to call it tenderness. When he glanced toward the office, she failed to look away. For one long second, they held each other through the dirty pain. Then he turned back to the mule. The pen in Mara's hand remained clean of ink for a while. She found Silas Crane's repair notes on a Tuesday, folded beneath old insurance papers in the bottom drawer. The early pages were neat, the later ones wandered. Ink pressed hard, then faint. Words begun straight and ending with a tremor. Mara had seen the same decline in the ledgers. She knew what those pages cost Caleb. Every time a hinge broke or a pulley seized, he had to open a book where a dead man's hand failed line by line. So she copied the current repairs onto clean sheets in her own hand, not to erase Silas, to spare Caleb from having to keep reopening the part where Silas disappeared. She left the old notebook tied shut and set the copy where Caleb would find it. He found it near dusk. His steps stopped at the office door, long enough for her to know he understood. He did not speak. Later, as she was closing the stove, he returned to the threshold. "Thank you, Miss Whit." He said it to the clean pages, not to her. She nodded and did not trust her voice. Jonah Crane was 15 and had started coming to the office after school let out. Silas's nephew, on paper, the future owner of Crane Freight. In life, a boy too young to carry the place and too old not to feel its weight already sitting on his shoulders. The first day, Mara turned the account book so he could see where Silas's hand had changed. "Here," she said. "See the freight totals? The numbers stay right. The writing is what suffered." Jonah touched the margin beside his uncle's last autumn entries. Not the words, only the edge of the page. So he still knew. Yes. He was not making mistakes? No. The boy sat with that, as if it had answered something larger than the question. After a while he said, "If the depot goes under, does it mean he did?" Mara laid her pen down. No adult should answer a boy like that while still holding a tool. "No," she said. "A place can fail for reasons that are heavier than one man. Your uncle kept this freight house moving until his body would not keep up with him. That is not failure. That is service." Jonah looked at the page. Caleb had come to the doorway with a broken trace hook in his hand. He saw the boy bent over the ledger. He saw Mara's hand resting near the page, not on it, leaving Jonah room to reach for the truth himself. Caleb put the trace hook in his pocket and went back outside without asking his question. He had learned something about Mara. Not all of it. Enough. The railroad man arrived on a Friday with polished boots and a voice trained to make honest people doubt the ground under them. Mr. Bellwether had papers in a leather case and no interest in speaking to Mara. He would wait for Mr. Rusk. "The matter concerns legal standing," he said, as though standing itself were a thing he owned. Caleb came in from the yard before Mara had finished refusing to be moved by him. Bellwether unfolded his papers on the loading plank. The rail company questioned whether Crane Freight had authority to alter winter storage rates after Silas Crane's death. The yard went quiet in the way working yards do when every man pretends not to listen and hears each word clearly. Bellwether turned to Mara. "I do not question the figures, Miss Whit. I question whether you are empowered to keep them." Caleb stepped beside her, not in front, beside. "The books speak through Miss Whit because she understands them better than anyone here." Bellwether's face tightened. "If the company objects, it may write to the county clerk," Caleb said. "Until then, we load by these entries." Mara opened the ledger on the plank. She set one finger beside the winter clause Silas had signed before he died. Bellwether read it again, then closed his case. "The documentation appears sufficient." After he left, Mara put coffee on. When it was hot, she carried a cup to the outer sill. Caleb's boots crossed the platform and stopped there. The quiet that followed was not drinking quiet. It was a man revising himself. A few minutes later, he came to the office door. "I should have known it before today." Mara looked up. "Known what?" "That your right to speak did not begin when I stood beside you." Then he went back to the yard. Mara stared at the empty doorway for a long time before the numbers came clear again. By December, the accounts were clean. That was the problem. A woman who had been hired for a crisis had to decide what she was when the crisis ended. Mara went to the post office and asked whether anyone in town needed winter bookkeeping. She did it because she was sensible. She did it because she had been poor enough to know that hoping for kindness was not the same as having wages. She did it because Mrs. Denby's warning had stayed in the room long after Mrs. Denby had left it. A man can cross a bridge all autumn and still leave a woman on the wrong side by Christmas. Caleb heard about the post office by way of the feed store. For 2 days he did nothing useful with the knowledge. He worked late. He ate badly. He crossed the bridge once and stopped in the middle, staring down at black canal water, as if the answer might float under him on a barge. He told himself asking Mara to stay would be selfish. Then he told himself letting her leave would be honorable. By Sunday, he understood both thoughts were wearing borrowed clothes. The truth was plainer and less flattering. Silence had been easier than courage. Restraint had become a respectable place to hide. Jonah came to the depot Sunday afternoon and found Mara tying string around a stack of copied invoices. Her valise stood beside the desk. He looked at it, then at her. "Mrs. Denby says you were looking for other work." "The books are steady now." He nodded as if she had answered a different question than the one he cared about. Then he looked at the shelves, at the ledgers she had cleaned, at the new repair sheets, at the winter rate file that no railroad man could shake loose. "I thought you were staying until I could read them without feeling stupid." The anger in his voice was not anger at her. It was fear with its fists closed. Mara asked him to sit. They went through the westbound column together until his numbers held. When he left, she stayed in the office after dark with the lamp burning, not letting herself name the ache in her chest. Naming had begun to cost too much. Caleb came just after supper time, when the street was nearly dark. He stopped at the office door, saw the valise, saw her hand on the desk, saw the lamp between them. His hat was in his hand. It turned once, then stopped. "Walk north with me." Mara did not move. "Now?" "For supper." The plainness of it changed the air. "I told Mrs. Pell at the post office where I was asking you to walk, and I told Jonah I would see you back before Mrs. Denby bolts the lower door. If that asks too much—" "It asks plainly," Mara said. "Yes." He held her eyes. "That is what I meant to do." A walk to her stair was one thing. This was not that thing. She could hear the difference before either of them stepped outside. They left the depot together. The bridge waited at the end of the road, dark inside its timber ribs. The first time she had crossed north with him, they had stopped at the cooper's shed. Not far enough to be a promise, too far to be nothing. This time he did not stop there. Neither did she. They passed the shed. They passed the forge, the coals banked low. They climbed the narrow stair to the 2 rooms above the cooper's back wall. A lamp burned in the window. "You left it lit," she said. "I wanted you to know the door." "I knew the road." "I know." She looked at him in the lamplight. "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." Inside, the room was plain, and too clean in the places where a nervous man had cleaned what was already clean. A small stove, 2 chairs, a table scarred by tools that should never have been set on it, a loaf wrapped in cloth, a pot of stew still cold, because Caleb had apparently gotten as far as intention and then abandoned all further planning. Mara removed her gloves. "Have you invited me to supper before making supper?" "I had considered the order less carefully than the invitation." "That is clear." "I own a pot." "A promising beginning." "And potatoes." "Now you are boasting." The laugh almost broke through them both. So they let work save them. He put the pot on the stove. She found cups on the shelf and plates in a crate he had forgotten was not a cupboard. They moved around each other stiffly at first, then less stiffly, then with the quiet ease of 2 people discovering that a small room can either crowd you or teach you how to belong in it. They spoke of ordinary things, Jonah's figures, the rail company, whether ice would slow the barges before the westbound flour cleared. But ordinary things changed shape at that table. They were not at the depot, not at the bridge. Not under the eyes of a town eager to make meaning before either of them dared to. They were in his room, with 2 plates and 1 crooked chair and a lamp left burning so she would know the door. When supper was done, Mara rose and stacked the plates. Caleb did not stop her. She set the breadcloth near the stove. For 1 quiet minute, the room held the outline of a life neither of them had asked for yet. Mara rested her hand on the back of the chair. "I do not mind crossing north." Her voice was steady. Her heart was not. Caleb set down the cup he had been drying. "I thought saying little was the careful thing." He did not look away now. "It was not careful with you." Mara waited. "The depot can stand without you for a time," he said. "Jonah will need years. I will need longer, but those are not the reasons I came." He took 1 breath. Not deep. Enough. "I am asking because I want the bridge to stop being the place where I leave you." Mara's hand tightened on the chair. "Caleb, I know you can go. I know you can earn your way without me. I know you did not come here looking for a man's roof." He reached for his hat, then seemed to decide he was done hiding his hands in it. He left it on the table. "Marry me, Mara. Not for crane freight, not for Jonah. Not because winter is coming." His voice lowered. "Because I would like the North Road to be yours, too." Mara looked around the room. The stove, the table, the chipped plate, the lamp in the window. Then she looked back at him. "I came because Silas Crane made me a promise on paper. I stayed because the work was honest." Her breath caught once, and she let it. But somewhere between the bridge planks, Jonah's questions, and the cup you found on the sill, I stopped thinking of this town as a place I had to survive. Caleb did not move. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." Only then did he cross the room. He took her hand the way careful men hold what they have nearly lost by being too careful. And for the first time since she had arrived in Marrow Bend, Mara let herself stand inside happiness without searching for the nearest exit. Later, Caleb walked her south once more. The same bridge, the same canal under it, the same town windows pretending not to watch. But at Mrs. Denby's stare, neither of them had to wonder what the crossing meant. They married on a cold Thursday in January, with Canal ice-white along the edges, and Jonah Crane standing beside the church stove with Silas's old pencil in his coat pocket. Mrs. Denby stood near the door after the service. She said nothing. She did not have to. The whole town saw which direction Caleb and Mara turned. They crossed north, past the bridge ribs where they had once measured silence by footsteps, past the cooper's shed where going farther had meant too much. This time, they did not stop. 9 years later, Crane Freight opened before dawn the way it always had. Jonah Crane was 24 and kept the winter rates himself, had done so for 2 seasons since Mara placed the ledgers in front of him and told him the books were no longer lessons. They were his. He stood on the platform in the gray morning, reading a bill of lading aloud without waiting for the yard to approve his voice. It did. Caleb crossed from the forge with 2 cups of coffee. Mara stood in the office doorway with her coat still on, watching a barge nose through the canal mist. The desk drawer still had the smooth brass pull. The outer sill still had a clean space where cups could rest. Caleb set one there anyway, because old gestures do not disappear when they are answered. They become part of the house. He stood beside her. For once, he did not look back to check a latch, a lamp, a ledger, a thing left undone. He looked at her, and the checking in his face stopped. Mara took the cup. Their fingers stayed where they were longer than the exchange required. Some evenings, after the depot closed, they still crossed the bridge together. Not because one of them was being walked home, not because the town needed proof, and not because the canal road was dark. They crossed because the bridge was no longer the place between them. It was the way home.